Good afternoon, ShellCon. How's everybody doing? Thank you so much to RaiseMe for having me. My name is Michael Taggart, and welcome to Professor Me, How to Successfully Self-Teach Tech Skills. I wanted to start by quickly introducing who I am and why you should listen to me about any of this at all. For most of my professional career, I was a K-12 educator and technologist. I was the director of technology for a number of different schools. I taught computer science. I built technology programs for those schools. And I also studied education. I have a master's in education leadership. My plan was to build a school someday. That didn't really work out the way I'd planned, like most careers do, and instead I fell in love with cybersecurity. So a few years ago, I transitioned my career to focus on that. These days, I'm a cybersecurity analyst at UCLA Health right here in LA. I have a number of other interests. I am a writer, I do martial arts. I'm pretty much an all-around dork. But I never stopped being a teacher. Even as I pivoted into information security, I wanted to continue sharing my knowledge, what I was learning, what I was excited about with others. So these days you can also find me on Twitch, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Saturdays, streaming about information security topics. But the important thing to know about this is that even though I went to school for English and then education, everything that I am paid to do on a day-to-day basis was self-taught. I ended up in IT in the first place because of an interest in technology from a very young age, but that I developed myself and didn't really have a whole lot of support for in school. So teaching others how to teach themselves is very near and dear to my heart. You know, in information security, there's just a never-ending stream of new things to learn. There's so much, and especially when you're just starting out, it can feel incredibly overwhelming. Not only is there so much to learn, there are so many potential resources to choose from, but sometimes guidance can be hard to come by. Mentorship is not that easy to find, especially high-quality mentorship, especially when you're just getting started or you're trying to break into the field. And there are going to be a lot of questions like, what's the right path? What happens if I get stuck? Where can I turn? And if you have access to people you can ask these questions, that's fantastic. Certainly after this, if you want to reach out to me over social media, things like that, feel free. I love helping folks out, or if you have somebody else in your life you can, that's great too. But learning how to support yourself along your learning journey is an incredibly powerful skill to acquire. So that's what I want to help you do with this talk today. What we're going to cover are some of the theories behind how teaching and learning work, which unbelievably are not actually taught in school. You're not taught about how you're getting taught, so you don't understand the whys of things. And by learning some of these underlying theories, these preconceptions about how teaching and learning work, you can better understand what works for you and why. We're then going to take some of those ideas and we're going to apply them to scenarios that you likely have encountered or will encounter in your learning journey in information security. So let's get started with our roadmap. And this is probably the most important theory concept that we're going to cover today, and that is Benjamin Bloom's taxonomy of learning. You may have seen this before or a different form of it. There are other shapes of Bloom's taxonomy that other researchers have come up with, but this is, I think, the most common shape that you see. And the most important thing to know about Bloom's taxonomy is the echelons of learning here, where you have remembering things, kind of rote memorization at the very bottom, and creation of new content in a subject area at the very, very top. You can also sometimes see versions of Bloom's taxonomy that have creating a community or leading or sharing knowledge at the top of the pyramid. This may seem, for those of you who are familiar with David Bianco's Pyramid of Pain, very, very similar. When we're talking about indicators of compromise or indicators of attack, when we're looking for threats in an environment, right, for defensive security work, the stuff at the bottom is really, really easy. Stuff that is maybe lower value, but also easy to detect or easy to change if you're an attacker. Similarly, the stuff at the bottom of the Bloom's taxonomy is kind of low-hanging fruit. It's important, but kind of low value. And it's a simpler learning task. It's simpler to produce and automate, and it's simpler to evaluate. You can also think of it a little bit like the OSI model, because as we move up the ladder, all of these different components are becoming layered on top of each other. You need one to move on to the next. Now, the problem is that there are a lot of materials toward the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy, a lot of free resources for self-guided learners to experience at the bottom of the echelons. But moving up is difficult, and as I said, you need to have one mastered before you can move to the next. And a huge problem that self-guided learners encounter is gaps. What if there are gaps in what you have available to yourself moving up this echelon in any given knowledge domain or skill set? It turns out that filling of gaps is what a role of a teacher actually is. It's trying to fill in missing rungs on that ladder. And, by the way, as you're moving through these different levels, checking for understanding, making sure you actually have mastery of a concept, moving up toward that higher echelon before moving on to the next idea. That checking for understanding is often referred to as formative assessment. It's an important feedback loop between the teacher and the learner to make sure that knowledge is getting transmitted successfully. Sometimes this can take some uncomfortable shapes in traditional teaching, like pop quizzes, but whatever shape it takes, it's a really, really important part of the teaching and learning process. And if you don't have a teacher who's guiding you, you yourself have to take on the role of formative assessment and maybe use some other resources to support yourself. And we're going to talk about how to do that, how to successfully create formative assessments for yourself as you're moving through your learning journey. We're going to talk a little bit about some specific learning resources that you may have used, and I have used every single one of these on this page. Cybrary, Codecademy, edX, Hack the Box, Try Hack Me, A Cloud Guru, Udemy, Pluralsight, and that's just getting started with the list. Each one of these resources has a set of theories about how we learn and how to teach that backs them up. And each one has a lot of value that you can extract from them. But each one also has gaps. And so we have to understand what those gaps might be, how to fill them in, and also what some of the pitfalls of these resources might be so we don't get trapped by them and we can move on in our learning journey. As I said, these resources are backed by a lot of theories about how teaching and learning work. And the academic version of education theory has a lot of these different terms that you may encounter. And we will talk about some of these today. Behaviorism, the zone of proximal development, constructivism, experiential learning, constructionism, cognitive load. But I don't want you to sweat these too much. They're cool to research if you want, and I really like learning about these. I've done a lot of writing about them myself. But there's a lot that goes into them, and they are theories, right? Because the truth is that even our best neuroscience doesn't know a whole lot yet about how learning really works. So we really are in the realm of psychology and theory. We can test our hypotheses with students, but it takes a long time, and it's not a perfect scientific experiment, right? Because people are people. So we don't really know a whole lot for certain about how any of this works. So I don't want you to sweat the theory too much. But what I've done is I've taken these areas of education theory and I've distilled them down into 4 maxims that I use in my own praxis and that I want to share with you. Hopefully, as you move along your learning journey, these 4 maxims will be of use to you, and we'll revisit them throughout this talk. So here they are, and we won't explain them too much just yet, but we will as we go through each of these different scenarios. So maxim number 1, you can't learn if you don't feel safe. Absolutely the most important one. You can't learn if you don't feel safe. Number 2, learning is inductive before deductive. That one's a little bit mysterious, but we'll clarify it soon. Number 3, failure is necessary. And number 4, maybe my favorite, all knowledge is story. If these seem a little abstract to you right now, that's totally fine. But this is something we're going to come back to time and time again in this talk. I really believe in these to my core. So stay tuned for more on these maxims. Let's talk a little bit first about computer programming. Now, I was an English major, and to be honest with you, I didn't write my first proper hello world in any programming language until I was already an IT professional. I started learning Python because I wanted to do my job better, and I thought that learning how to program would do that. And then I fell in love with it and started teaching it and learned different languages. And, you know, now I'm doing, assembly and binary exploitation and reverse engineering. So the journey continues. But I was already working in the field before I wrote my first programming language. And in part, that was because I was discouraged from pursuing computer science because I was not a particularly strong math student in school. It turns out that was because of how I was getting taught, but we'll leave that alone for the moment. Later, I came back to programming and taught myself how to do it. How? By looking for free resources on the internet. And there's never been more resources available for self-guided learners to learn computer programming. But that doesn't mean that it's easy. By no means is it easy. One site that a lot of folks end up landing on when they're beginning their programming journey, or even if they're into it at some point, is Codecademy. And whenever I'm mentioning these platforms, I'm not trying to single them out. I am using them as case studies for patterns that I observe in these resources writ large. So I'm not trying to dunk on Codecademy itself. And actually, I like a lot of what Codecademy does. But what are some things that will happen? In the learning experience of Codecademy, you are presented with some instructional material, right? This white space you see on the left where there's a lot of language, there's a lot of models, a lot of examples, and then you are given an instruction to reproduce code in a certain way, and you have to match whatever Codecademy is expecting. You hit run and either you succeed and you move on, or you fail and you don't, and you're given a little bit of feedback about how you could maybe do better. So bottom line, correct answers are rewarded, negative answers are punished. Feels harsh, but there is a negative feedback, right? You're not progressing. I hate to say it, but this is at the very, very base of Bloom's taxonomy. This is what we would consider behaviorism or rote learning, where positive desired behavior is rewarded and negative behavior is discouraged. Behaviorism is incredibly limiting. It's pretty good for pets, but not so good for humans. As I said, it's limited to the lower rung of Bloom's taxonomy. You can't really get much beyond remembering stuff with behaviorism, because how could you possibly evaluate understanding or evaluation or any of those higher levels with simple right and wrong? Those ideas aren't that simple. This, by the way, is the problem with every single math test you've ever taken. I want to pause for a minute and talk about risk and reward. I know this was something that I experienced, and I know that a lot of my students experienced it as well, and when I spoke to them about it, it became clear that a specific model of instruction that I had been using previously wasn't really that healthy. So, which was asking a question in the front of a classroom, and then I had an answer in mind, and then I waited for somebody to raise their hand and give me the right answer. And maybe I didn't wait long enough, or the same people always kept raising their hands, and then the same people also kept not raising their hands. And it wasn't until I was a few years into my teaching that I bothered asking why. And it turns out that even in that very specific situation, there's this massively complex equation of risk and reward for students, whether or not they should raise their hand. And if they raise their hand and they get called on and they know the answer, what does that mean for them? There may be social implications. There may be personal self-esteem implications, whether they get it right, whether they get it wrong. What I was accidentally creating in that environment was a high risk, low reward environment, which is pretty toxic to actual learning. um, Coming back to maxim one, you can't learn if you don't feel safe. Now, let's abstract that out a little bit from that situation in the classroom. In a behaviorist scenario, you have high risk of getting something wrong and low reward, which is you get it right and then you have to do it again and again and again, situation. And because it's a behavioral model, there's probably not a whole lot of support for you in that situation. So you want to beware of anything that looks like this, where it's very much easy answers and a lot of them in quick succession with very little reward for success and also very little support. Again, think about reading all of those instructions as a new programming student. There's a lot to understand there, and you may not be in a place to be able to understand it yet. And yet there you are, faced with the programming terminal and the run button, not really sure how to proceed. It can be very, very frustrating and very, very discouraging. So in a behavioral model like what Codecademy does present, there's not just high risk and low reward, but also very little support for the learner. Now, let's flip that on its head a little bit, and let's say you are pretty good at what you're doing in Codecademy or some of the other platforms that are like it, and you keep answering simple question after simple question. What is going on in that situation? What you may be dealing with then is something referred to as gamification, where the answering of questions has become the goal. And you are playing the game very, very well. But that doesn't mean you're actually learning what you want to learn. It means that you're playing the game. There are a few platforms that have this going on. TryHackMe, if you're familiar with that learning platform, has the concept of streaks, where you log in every day, you answer a question every day, you build up a streak. And so all of a sudden, the objective becomes maintain your streak rather than learn concepts. Not all of the resources on TryHackMe are created equally, so it is possible to maintain a streak without actual substantial learning. Hack the Box has the same problem. We'll talk about Hack the Box a little bit later, but Hack the Box has the same thing with points, and if you don't log in for a while, you start losing the points that you've accrued from successful exercises that you've completed in the past. Even capture the flag competitions like the one going on right now, if you do these habitually, and depending on the challenge level of them, may not actually be that instructive, may in fact just be a game for you that you're playing. Now, that's not to say that you can't learn from any of these platforms. Certainly you can. But when you are focusing on the reward mechanism rather than the learning itself, you are playing a game. You might learn on the way, but the objective is misaligned. And really what we're talking about here is motivation. I put this on here because I have a Duolingo problem, and maybe you do too. I am trying to learn Chinese, and I have never met a more effective extrinsic motivation strategy than what Duolingo does to you. That bird guilts you into logging in and completing language lessons every single day. And it's effective. It's effective. The bird gets sad if you don't log in. They're pushy with their notifications. For real, it is an effective strategy. But it's effective at doing what? It's effective at getting me to engage. Is it effective in getting me to learn? I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it's specifically about getting me to learn. I know that I'm learning some Chinese along the way, but I also know that one of my motivations is to keep my streak going. Duolingo is a great example of extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation. And of course, extrinsic motivation is where the desire to continue whatever the activity is comes from outside of you, whether it's keeping your Duolingo streak up or your TryHackMe streak or getting paid, whatever it is, these motivations come from outside rather than the internal motivation of wanting to learn a new skill or wanting to change your life in some way, whatever it is, but that comes from inside, right? And those motivations, though harder to maintain, are a little bit richer, a little bit more nutritious and more nourishing. They will take you farther. Also, extrinsic motivation, if you think about it a little bit, can be a little infantilizing because it doesn't trust you to take control over your own learning. Now, I trust you to take control over your own learning, which is why I'm going to urge you to be aware of resources that solely rely on extrinsic motivation. It can be a great tool to help you get started or stay motivated. I have no problem with using these tools. Look, I'm going to log into Duolingo today. I'm going to complete my Chinese lesson. The bird is going to be satisfied. But that can't be all I'm motivated by. And once it is, we've lost something. We've lost the ability to move beyond that bottom level of Bloom's taxonomy, because the kinds of things that tools that rely on extrinsic motivation can teach you can only go so far. Remember, as we move up Bloom's taxonomy into those higher echelons of understanding, evaluating, predicting, and creation, of course, you can no longer automatically reward those behaviors. How could you possibly? Because they involve interacting with others. So you don't want to get caught by games. You don't want to stay in the lower echelons of Bloom's taxonomy. How are you going to do that? Well, you're going to create a learning plan. That's, I think, the first proactive piece of advice here that I have for you. You have to create a learning plan. So think about what it is you want to learn, what you want to accomplish, whatever it might be. And you can split it out a little bit, whether it's a skill goal or a knowledge goal. I want to be able to X. That's a skill goal. I want to understand, or I want to be able to read, so whatever it is, knowledge goals. These are a little bit different, and it's worth distinguishing them because the approach to them is going to be slightly different. Usually knowledge goals, and by the way, skill goals may have embedded knowledge goals, but usually knowledge goals are going to have a little bit more reading first, then practice. Skill goals may have more practice. It just depends on how you're setting that up. You also want to break big ideas down. So I want to learn web app pen testing. That's a gigantic field. Break it down. What are the things that you know that are involved in web app pen testing? Once you have those broken down, can they be broken down further? Get as granular as you possibly can. And once you've done that, what do you already know? And if you can't break it down, by the way, if you can't break down these component parts, that's okay. You will be able to later, but find some part of it that you can break down. I think that is an important place to start, because whatever you can break down, that's going to be your starting point. We'll talk about why in just a second. Being able to break something down means that you know it a little bit more in more detail than the other areas that you can't. So let's take a look at a very beginning mind map for a learning plan. And we talked about web app pen testing, and let's take a look at some of the things that we see here on this map of concepts and skills and even tools that you would have to master if you want to be successful with web app pen testing, something that I do every day now. So we have enumeration, right? Scanning through a website to see what it has going on. There are tools like Dirbuster or FFUF. There are a bunch of others, but those are some tools. You have using proxies like the Burp Suite or ZA proxy. If you want to understand web apps, you're going to have to understand JavaScript to some degree. So we have to understand what the cross-site scripting vulnerability looks like. We're going to have to get those OWASP top 10s. We're going to have to understand how front-end frameworks like Angular or React might work. We're going to have to understand how JavaScript takes control of form submissions, how it handles user input. There's still plenty of legacy code out there, so we're going to have to understand PHP. We're going to understand how PHP handles form submissions. If we're dealing with a web app, we're dealing with a web server. So we're also going to have to understand a lot about how servers work. Now, I was a network administrator before I did this, so maybe I understand a little bit more about HTTP status codes or just how requests and responses between a server and a client actually work. And maybe I know a little bit about networking because I've done a lot of networking. So I understand IP addresses and networking configurations. I understand service ports and all of that. And that, because I can break that down, maybe that's my entry point. Maybe I start there and I begin creating some connections between how networking configurations work and how that is related to the larger configuration of a web server on a system. And then once I have that set up, once I understand how a web server works, maybe I could take a look at those HTTP headers and understand what it is that the server is actually saying when it's making a response to the client. So using what I already know, I can start to make predictions about how related concepts might work. I might be wrong, but that's okay too, because I have hypotheses that I can test. I have questions to ask. Backing up just for a second, one thing that often new learners or even experienced learners will encounter in their journey is they'll get stuck in a very specific way, which is they won't know what they don't know. They won't know what kinds of questions to ask. And that is usually an indication that they haven't quite followed this path, that they have landed someplace with no way to orient themselves. That happens sometimes. And what I'm trying to do here is provide a map to avoid that particular thing, because that feeling is the worst. It's so discouraging because you don't know where to look or even what questions to ask if you can ask questions to get help. So starting with what you know and building out from there. Why does this matter? Because learning is inductive before it's deductive. Maxim number 2. When we think about a body of knowledge, we think about web app pen testing, or we think about biology, and we even think about the way that these curricula can be designed, it's often very top down. It's like, okay, well, what's everything that we need to teach in this field? And then we'll design how to teach every single one of those things. But that's not actually how the human brain works. That's not how we experience knowledge. And you know this if you've ever gotten lost in Wikipedia. If you've ever started down a journey of moving from one link to another, and it was so easy to just fall down that rabbit hole. Why? Because Wikipedia and your mind make it so easy to make connections between seemingly disconnected, disparate ideas. But that's actually how your brain is working. You start where you have a firmer footing, and then you move on from there. The other axis we have to think about here is time. So you start where you have that firm footing and you move. You get a firmer footing there, you move on from there, and again, and again, and again, and again. It doesn't really matter where you start, because over time, almost like a Roomba bouncing around the room, over time you will cover a lot of territory. And once you've covered enough of that territory, all of a sudden, you're going to be able to make predictions about how completely separate knowledge domains work, because you may be able to make connections to knowledge you already have. This, by the way, is constructivism in action. Constructivism was a theory put forward by ed theorist Jean Piaget. And he theorized that knowledge was built in schemes or mental models about concepts. And that's exactly what we're talking about, is building out these schemes, these domains of knowledge. And they get richer over time. They get more detailed over time. Now, one thing that Piaget, because he was focusing on early childhood education, he never really talked a lot about how to move from one knowledge domain to another. He didn't really flesh out that idea of those relationships. But I have some ideas about that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But again, this idea of beginning with what you know and then inducing from there into a broader field by making connection after connection is actually how learning works. And it's also a much more digestible way to begin because you're not looking at the whole picture at once. You're starting with something familiar. So I encourage you to make this kind of a plan for yourself, for whatever you're trying to learn, and beginning with what you know. Even if it's not a whole lot about the field yet, that's okay. Start with something where you at least have some ability to make a relationship to familiar concepts. All right, so you have your motivation. You know you need to move beyond simple gamification or extrinsic motivation. You want to try something real. So let's talk about the good and not so good in experiential learning. So I said we would talk about Hack the Box. Here it is. I'm using Hack the Box as my example here, but the truth is that what we're going to talk about, it can apply to any lab environment, especially lab environments that have kind of low support. And the truth is that learning by doing is the only way to really go beyond the lowest rung of Bloom's taxonomy. We have to get our hands dirty. You can't just read about it. You have to go do it. And this was the hobby horse of John Dewey. Dewey was an educational reformer in the early 20th century, and he really had a problem with the educational system in the United States at the time, which was very much focused on memorization and rote learning. It wasn't really producing effective workers, but we'll leave aside the connection between public education and the Industrial Revolution for now. But the point was that Dewey believed that we could do better for students. And one of the ways in which you could do better is this idea of an experience-based learning model where students actually had to do things, not just memorize things. And Dewey's idea for the teacher in this model was, I think, really, really formative for education moving forward, but also useful for our purposes here. Dewey made the teacher a guide for experiences, correcting mistakes when necessary, but really as a facilitator, right? Not just somebody saying, do this, but someone who was making an environment in which learning could take place. There are, of course, a lot of other theorists that were working along the same lines. You may be very familiar with one of them, Maria Montessori. Schools modeled after her theories are still very, very popular today. So you have to do in order to learn. But in Hack the Box, let's think about what happens. You go to turn on one of these machines, you go to begin attacking one of these boxes, and maybe you know something about this and maybe you don't. Maybe you're just getting started. Getting started in Hack the Box is super hard. In fact, there's even a literal barrier to entry to register for the site. You have to discover something hidden in order to do so. It's literally gatekept, which I have some real issues with. And here's the other problem. You'll hear in Hack the Box, in the forums, and even amongst a lot of hackers from a certain subculture, the concept of try harder. And trying hard is a great thing. Persistence and resilience, super, super valuable mental skills. But try harder only works if you know what to try at all. If you're in that situation that we described before, where you don't know what questions to ask at all, and when you go to ask for help, you are met with scorn, it's very, very discouraging. Let's go back to Maxim 1. You can't learn if you don't feel safe. How safe are you going to feel when you're met with try harder and no real answers to your questions? And at best, you're left to the mercy of somebody who's in the forums who's willing to help out. This is not a recipe for success on its own. Hack the Box without support and a potentially intimidating community. And I'm not trying to ding Hack the Box. That's just how it works. It's a problem we have in our community where there is this kind of culture. It's not as welcoming as it could be. It's not as supportive as it could be. And what we're left with is a high risk, high reward environment. Again, it's not quite as toxic as the high risk, low reward environment, because in that environment, why try? In high risk, high reward, you're still discouraging people who are less risk averse because there's a lot of risk, right? They don't want to do that, even if there's a lot to be gained by taking the risk. Learning, especially at the very beginning, I believe truly requires a low risk, high reward situation to build up that confidence, self-esteem, gaining some of that initial knowledge as a footing, like we talked about before, and then you can start changing up the ratio between risk and reward. But it has to start with low risk, high reward. Learners requiring support is not shameful. It should never be considered so. That's a lie that school taught us and society taught us. Scaring new learners away from seeking guidance only leads to negative outcomes, and it leads to cliquishness and elitism and essentially a brain drain in the industry, because we're shooing away people who could be unbelievably talented but needed welcoming, needed safety. So there is value in Hack the Box. I use Hack the Box a lot, but it takes some additional scaffolding to bring it out, to make Hack the Box and other lab environments like it as powerful as they could be. And one of the most important concepts that you have to grasp in order to take advantage of these lab environments is Lev Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, the ZPD. Now, you know this idea already, even though Vygotsky put a name to it. This is the Goldilocks zone of difficulty, right? Basically what Vygotsky was saying was, in order to learn something new, to truly learn something new, you have to be in this sweet spot of not too easy, that you really already know what you're doing, not too hard so that you're totally at sea, just hard enough so that you're at the edge of your capabilities and you're stretching yourself. It's like a stretch, right? You don't, rip down into a full split or whatever. You want some discomfort because that's what stretching is, but it shouldn't be painful. Now, here's the thing. The role of a teacher is in large part to identify a student's zone of proximal development and constantly recalibrate it and create experiences that are aligned to that difficulty level. But if you don't have someone doing that for you, and by the way, it's really, really hard to automate this, the best educational software does not really have this squared away. Without creating that proper zone of proximal development, or without having someone do that for you, a lot of introspection is required. And that introspection has to take a couple of specific shapes. Let's first talk about the idea of metacognition, thinking about your thinking. Whenever you finish with a lab like Hack the Box, or even Try Hack Me, or any of the others that are out there, Pen Tester Lab, which is sponsoring the CTF, or Pen Tester Academy, whatever resource you choose that's like this, that is very high risk, low, maybe high reward, but also low support. You have to put these extra pieces of scaffolding into play. You have to think about what worked and what didn't. You have to specifically either write it down or take some time and really ponder what you could do, what you were confused by, and what you need to explore next. If you get super lost and you really can't move on, read the walkthrough. It is not cheating because it's not a competition, it's learning. Reading the walkthroughs can be unbelievably useful because when you don't know what you don't know, the walkthroughs can give you some of that scaffolding and give you some of the terms to research next. It can be a jumping off point for your learning. Now, should you only read the walkthroughs? No, you should definitely be trying these challenges out. But when you get stuck, and you will get stuck, it's okay. You want to get into the habit of researching what you don't know, but use the walkthroughs to find out what it is that you didn't know. And then go back and try the challenge again. Repeat it. Repeat it until you can explain it. Explain why it works, how it works, and what you're doing. You have to do it this way because, maxim number 3, failure is necessary. Failure isn't just about not succeeding. That's a really limited understanding of what failure is. Failure is reaching an endpoint. If we think about a pathfinding algorithm, you go through the maze and you hit a dead end and then you backtrack and then you try another one. It eventually reaches the goal. Those dead ends were a necessary part of the process in order to reach the objective. Failure is necessary not only because you discover what isn't working, but because every time you go back and do things again, the repetition strengthens the memory of what is working. Repetition is necessary for memory. And at the end of the day, what we're talking about is building up memory, specifically what is referred to as episodic memory, remembering a thing that happened and keeping that in mind the next time you go to do something similar. There lies wisdom. In addition to following this maxim of repeating and reading the walkthroughs, you want to try to supplement, if you can, with more guided resources, especially once you've researched the walkthrough and you have new terms to begin a new part of your learning. There's a lot of great material on YouTube, not to log roll too much, but my own YouTube channel and the other InfoSec streamers that are out there on Twitch, we're putting out content all the time that is exactly designed for people like you and like us who are on this self-guided learning journey. There's a lot out there for everyone to discover. There are also some really well-structured learning tools from organizations. I particularly think that Port Swigger's Academy for web stuff is a great example of how to do this well, where you have a lot of material, a lab that demonstrates the concept, but also a lot of support for how to complete it. I really, really like the way that they've put things together. I also think a lot of the rooms on TryHackMe have been put together with learning in mind and have been done very, very successfully. So if you're struggling with Hack the Box, for example, you might want to pivot over to TryHackMe, just to name another place to go, and see how you can do there. These, of course, are not the only examples. These are just some of the ones that I've used in my teaching and learning very, very successfully. But of course, the other caveat with TryHackMe is make sure that you're getting the high nutrition stuff, right? You're not just chasing after those streaks. You're not just playing the game to fill in answers. You're actually understanding what you're doing as you answer those questions. Just to expound a little bit on why failure and repetition is so important, because repetition is important. Our brains are leaky. I think that a lot of times in school, we were taught you're supposed to read something or see something once and just like get it. That's not how our brain works. We're processing so much information all the time. There's no way that even if you're focusing on one thing, you're going to be able to absorb all the information in it in one go. It's just not possible. You have to take multiple passes, and each pass collects a little bit more of the picture. Right? Think about it like collecting individual pixels of an image, right? Maybe the first pass collects 10%. Maybe the next pass collects another 20% or whatever. Over time, the full picture begins to take shape, but one pass ain't going to do it. And in fact, once you start collecting those parts of the picture, now you know where you don't need to focus as much anymore. And moving forward, failure informs what does need focus. So once more, failure is necessary. It is not shameful. It is never shameful. If someone is putting you down about not being able to succeed in one way or another, that's a toxic relationship, and they're being harmful to you, and they're wrong. It is okay to fail as long as you keep trying. Failure is necessary. Now, let's talk about when labs do go sideways. And maybe you've been in a situation like this. This has happened to me a number of times, where we've spent so much time. This isn't really about support so much. This is really about a lab experience that was not totally built super well to focus on the learning rather than the lab setup. And I've definitely been in labs like this where we spent so much time setting up a lab that the actual work of a lab is secondary, right? Whether that's in a classroom where we spend a lot of time building up whatever we were supposed to be experimenting with. This happened to be a lot in school. Or even if it's doing, this is a shot from INE. A lot of their learning materials are actually pretty well set up, but some of them do have a lot of steps. Or maybe you're doing a demonstration from a really, really experienced engineer or cybersecurity professional, but maybe they're so good at what the technical aspects of their job are that they're not totally clear on the educational parts of it. In that situation, what can happen is that you spend so much of your energy setting the lab up or on the kind of weird administrivia of it, the technicals of it, that you're not focusing on the learning material. This speaks to an important, kind of more recent education theory called cognitive load theory. And what I wanted to convey about cognitive load theory is there are three kinds of cognitive load, mental work, that your brain is doing when you're learning something. The first is the intrinsic load, which is essentially the inherent complicated, whatever the inherent difficulty of a concept is. So whether it's hunting, whether it's memory forensics, or if it's the Einstein field equation, or whatever it is, it has some intrinsic complexity. And that's the price of admission. Then you have the extraneous load, which is the load around the learning exercise, like setting up the lab or figuring out the other stuff that you have to do to get to the actual meat of the material. Whatever that is, that's extraneous load. And then you have the germane load, which is the thing you're actually trying to learn. Now, here's the problem. In poorly constructed labs, the extraneous load is going to outweigh the germane load. And usually I try to go for an 80-20 split on that, right? There's going to be some setup in a lab, but you want most of the time and effort spent on the thing you're trying to learn. If you're not doing that, if there's more setup than there is learning, you're learning whatever the lab technology is. You're not learning the actual objective. So I just wanted to shout this one out to be aware of when labs look like this, that you may be spending energy in not maybe the most useful ways. All right, friends, we're coming to the end of the examples and guidance here. And so I want to give you the secret weapon for self-guided learning. This is the most powerful tool in your arsenal. And if you use this one thing, your learning goals will progress in ways you cannot imagine. Are you ready? Here it is. Probably a disappointing answer, probably one you could have guessed, but I think it really, really matters. I don't actually care if you use a pen or paper. I don't know the last time I've actually used a pen and paper to write out a journal entry. I think it's been about a decade, but some research does show that it works better for some people. So you do you. But the important part here is that maxim 4, all knowledge is story, or all knowledge is narrative. Writing or explaining ideas to others forces our thoughts into order, and that order creates connections between ideas. All knowledge is a story. You cannot explain something to someone else without telling a story of some sort or another. And that story gives order to your ideas and also gives order to your own understanding of whatever that idea is. So it's useful for both the person, even if it's a journal, that you're explaining it to, and yourself. For me, teaching actually does this. I reinforce my knowledge by sharing it, and I clarify my knowledge by sharing it because I make connections between ideas as I'm explaining things that I never would have done if I had just left it bouncing around in my head. Remember back to Jean Piaget and learning schemes and creating mental models of knowledge? And I said that he never really touched on how to move from one knowledge scheme to another. So here's my take on this. Here's my contribution to education theory. This is how. That narrative is in fact the bridge between knowledge domains. When you make a connection from one idea to another, this is like this in this way, this is not like this in this way, you are telling a story about how those ideas are related. You're telling that story to yourself. And here's the kicker. The more you retell that story, the stronger the memory of that connection will be, meaning the more ingrained that understanding becomes. So not just telling the story, but retelling the story is an important part of learning. And the story is always going to change, and that's okay, because so are you. Your mental model should not be static. They should be dynamic, because you're making new connections all the time and adding mental models, adding schemes which you can use to draw new connections between ideas. And the more you write, the more you explain this, the more you journal, the more you share with others. I said that the top of the echelon could be sharing as well as creating. There it is. And it actually filters back down and strengthens the other levels of Bloom's taxonomy because of these connections you make through the power of story. So I want to end here with a quick portrait of the successful autodidact or self-guided learner. What activities are they engaged in? As we've discussed so far, what does the totality of that look like? They have a plan. They start from what they know and what they don't know. But what they don't know, they research. They practice, they fail, they repeat. And they know that it's okay to fail. By the way, they also seek out safe spaces in which to learn because they know that they need that in order to begin their learning journey. They're going to assess their progress as they go. One way or another, they have to understand where their zone of proximal development is in order to be successful. They're going to watch out for pitfalls like gamification or wholly extrinsic motivation. And as they go, they're going to share the story of their learning, either through writing or teaching others or communicating with somebody about what's going on, but they are using the power of story to strengthen and order their thoughts. A quick reminder about the maxims. You can't learn if you don't feel safe. Learning is inductive before deductive. Failure is necessary, and all knowledge is story. Okay. This is the end, and I want to quickly talk about what is possible using tools like this. In 1974, the Palo Alto Research Center from Xerox, who, by the way, were pioneers in a lot of what we take for granted in modern computing technology, like the mouse and the graphical user interface, they went to a middle school in Palo Alto and started teaching, in 1974, the Smalltalk programming language to a bunch of middle schoolers. And they did so in a pretty unique way. And they cataloged their work in an article called Teaching Smalltalk, and you can find it on archive.org. But here's a quick sample from it. As the authors write, in their initial experiences, the students explore models that get them into programming with quick and fun results. Low risk, high reward. At the same time, they get sufficient knowledge about the basic concepts so that they can carry out project ideas of their own. In this manner, programming techniques are taught and practiced within a structured framework that encourages innovation on the part of the students. This is exactly what we're looking for. And how did it happen? It happened because the teachers provided the documentation for the Smalltalk language, repeated exercises in which to experiment freely, support to do so, but not rote memorization, and the space and time to experiment and learn. And the results were nothing short of phenomenal. One student, Marion, I just can never forget this story, from these basic principles in 1975 was able to invent a drawing program with a graphical user interface before that kind of thing even existed. But Marion was able to do it using this kind of environment. So I want to share this story with you because I want to tell you that wherever you are in your learning journey, you can get where you're trying to go. It is possible. Hopefully, the tools that we've shared today are going to be of some use to you on your journey. So just to end, I want to wish you the very best on your learning journey. I want to thank ShellCon and RaiseMe for having me for this talk. And just continue learning, continue growing, continue sharing, and you will make this community stronger for your own contributions to it. So thank you very much, and good luck.